Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the final speaker, who is also the keynote speaker, talking about circularity at the center. It's Dr. Anand Narasimhan. Dr. Anand is at Microsoft and is a general manager of cloud supply chain sustainability. His group focuses on innovation across the supply chain in support of Microsoft's commitment to sustainable and carbon negative future. So without much ado, here is Dr. Anand.
Thank you, Dharmesh. Really nice to hear your voice again as well. I also want to say thank you to Kari for helping me with these slides. So if we can possibly get them on, I don't see them yet. Okay, there we go. Well, firstly, thank you for this opportunity to OCP, the planners, and to folks who are attending. I have been listening a bit to the presentations over the last few days. I'm really pleased to see the focus on sustainability. This is definitely very timely, and whether it's in the presentations or in conversations that are happening outside of the presentations, this is a very important topic, obviously something that we're all very passionate about, and I'm really glad to see the communities coming around this too. This is a very large challenge, of course, that we're all faced with. I don't need to introduce climate change and its impacts to anyone in this audience. We produce about 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases every year. We are producing about the same amount in metric tons of waste annually. A lot of our ecosystems are endangered, and people are in various parts of the world are more vulnerable as well. Now, in order to meet our climate change targets, a fundamental shift needs to happen in the way our economy functions and the way we think about creating value. We have to move away from the way we do things today with the sort of a linear economy into something that is much more regenerative by design. And circular economy offers us a framework to think about strategies for reducing emissions across entire value chains, to retain embodied energy in the materials we produce, in the products we build, and to extend useful life for as long as possible, to sequester carbon in the products that we build and use, eventually to recycle and return them back into useful lifetimes. There are many ways to think about this, of course. In a very simplistic way, if you just think about four simple materials that are widespread in use, as you see on the screen, a very simple example. Even if you just think about steel and aluminum and cement and so on, through circular approaches, just focusing on those materials could result in about a 40% reduction in emissions across entire value chains. So there's, of course, much more we could be doing if we were all thinking about it in a circular way. If you can move to the next slide, please, Kari, thank you. So there are significant barriers to making all this happen. Circular economy principles are generally not considered when you think about designing a product and through the entire value chain. At design stage, you might think about materials, but if you don't think about what happens to it at end of life, things break down and you don't get the full benefit of a circular economy. Business models must embody these principles from the very beginning, and we're really thinking through all of that now as we transform our own supply chains. There are regulatory disincentives as well. People are used to buying new. Financial models are built that way. Various regulations in countries around electronic waste, the movement of materials across boundaries of countries are generally restrictive for creating extended lifetimes and for empowering companies to move towards a circular economy. So I also want to talk a little bit about a couple of other areas here. I talked about collaboration between the start of life and the end of life from design through recycling. Also, the markets that exist for used components and used assets are highly fragmented. In some parts of the world, they're quite mature, in some parts they're not. If you think about this as global value chains, global supply chains, that needs to change as well. A very interesting point around sustainable materials. As we've been on this journey for a few years, one of the things we're finding is that if you do identify sustainable materials, many times what ends up happening is you try to produce those materials at scale, there are problems. The companies who produce these are not large enough to produce materials at the scale that we require them. Also, if you think about those materials and the recycling of those materials further downstream, those mechanisms aren't fully built out either. So to do this correctly, you have to think through the entire lifetime of every material, every replacement material that you think about. You can go to the next slide, please. So at Microsoft, I want to describe our strategy in a very, very simple way. My colleagues at Microsoft may have presented a version of this in the last few days. So for those of you who've heard of it, this might be a little bit of a repeat, but broadly, it's a three-part strategy. Starting in the top right, we look at design principles. So design for sustainability around various aspects, whether it's looking at material choices or optimizing for various aspects of energy, for instance, or material efficiencies. Thinking about design for repair, for recycling, for reusability, for remanufacturing, etc. All of those, if they're considered in the design stage at the very front end of this value chain, then a lot of our actions further down become much easier to manage. Then around the circular supply chain itself, this is probably the area of biggest impact for us, and I think for a lot of supply chains like ours. And this is around how you engage with suppliers. What we have done over the past several years is taken a very hard look at our supplier ecosystem, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the point of this program area is really to get into very deep engagement with our suppliers and to get them aligned to our reduction roadmaps and to watch our progress collectively over time. The third part of our strategy on the top left is the circular cloud. This essentially is the treatment of assets that come out of our data centers when it's time to decommission them. What do you actually do with them? How do you extend useful lives? How do you extract as much value as possible throughout the supply chain before things finally get recycled and returned back into active use? So let's go to the next slide. I'll talk about each of these, of course. So supplier engagement being the biggest part, I'll talk about that first. What we've done over the past few years is to look at all our suppliers. We've prioritized them based on the value or the impact of emissions reduction potential. We've ranked them based on what we think is their maturity. We've measured their emissions footprint for the things that we procure from them. And we've engaged in a dialogue with them in a very detailed way to get ourselves aligned with them on their ambitions and their aspirations for reducing over time, and to get them as closely aligned to our reduction targets as possible. So our reduction requires us to get to 55% emissions reduction over this period from now to 2030. And to the extent possible, we'd like our suppliers to align with those targets as well. Some suppliers, of course, do better than others, but this is a journey for everyone. And once we're engaged with them, the next portion, of course, is the execution. And here it's a lot about very granular and very frequent communications around the areas of impact, whether it's in the manufacturing stage, the distribution stage, transport, logistics, end of life treatment. Every single area has a potential impact that we want to capture and we want to discuss in a transparent way. So a lot of the focus here is around methodologies to determine where our suppliers' emissions are, what hotspots exist that we could focus on, how we look at performance. Of course, we do have leverage as buyers, and we do have contractual obligations as well written into all our contracts, but those are only meaningful if we have a way to substantially engage. And that requires long-term partnerships with suppliers to make all this happen. Let's go to the next slide, talk about design for sustainability. And this I know is a topic that my colleagues have spoken about as well. This is at the front end of the value chain. A lot of our focus here, of course, is on material and energy efficiency. And we are trying to focus on designing for repair and reusability, remanufacturing, and for recycling. And as we do all this, we want to optimize across all of these things so that the future decisions through the design stage gates and well into procurement, manufacturing, distribution, and use, all the way through recycling, are considered well ahead of time. The impacts, of course, are quite straightforward once you get to it. That's fine. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Kari. One of the decisions we made a few years ago was that for everything we're going to do around sustainability, the methodologies we use, the platforms we build, all of those would be exposed to our suppliers, to our partners, to our customers. And the way we're doing that is to build common platforms and to surface those, whether it's through products, such as the emissions impact dashboard we announced a short while ago, or Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability, which is something that came out in the last few weeks. These are all ways for us to surface everything we're doing for ourselves to our customers and our partners. And we're looking at this primarily around carbon and waste to begin with, and then of course extending to other aspects as well that we're looking at. Everything we're doing is in support of our reduction targets between now and 2030 and to carry that forward. So these are fundamental shifts in our own supply chain, but the tools and platforms that we're putting together are intended to be offered to industry. All of the methodologies we're creating are openly shared for criticism and for improvement, of course. This is a shared journey we have with everybody, and we couldn't possibly do this without exposing everything we're doing to our broader ecosystem. Let's go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about our progress. I'll let the numbers speak for themselves. We've done a lot in the last few years. Our focus around emissions reduction, of course, as I mentioned, the supply chain focus around reducing emissions at design through design interventions, through supplier interventions, and circular cloud. We're also, of course, procuring enough carbon removal to make up for gaps in our performance. It's always going to be a combination of those because we're trying to decouple our growth from the use of natural resources, but there is going to be a gap in terms of how much we can reduce and how much we might need to take care of through carbon capture and storage methods. And the first goal, of course, is to reduce as much as possible, and then when we can't, then we'll resort to these methods. Around water, of course, quite a few projects underway. Lots of focus on diversion from landfill. I want to make a point here around electronic waste in our cloud supply chain. We don't have any landfill, which is nice. But if we look at our broader supply chain, there still is some progress yet to be made. And we're on a path towards getting there as well. We're also on our way to build a planetary computer to produce environmental data sets that can be used widely by everyone, essentially to gain further insights on what can be done to improve outcomes for our ecosystems. So let's go to the next slide. We've talked in the past, and Microsoft has made some announcements about our work in circular economy. One of the things we did a couple of years ago was to think about what we might want to do at our data centers to ensure the best possible outcome for every component and every asset. So we started to experiment with the concept called circular centers. We proved this model out. Essentially, these circular centers are production warehouses that sit within our data center campuses. And they intercept, or actually they predetermine what happens to every component that's in the fleet, so that when it's time to decommission a server or any asset really, you already know where every part needs to go. So there's a little video around this. If you're able to show it on the screen there, I'll pause for a couple of minutes to let it run its course. I don't think the volume works there. Kari, never mind. I don't think the volume is working so well. How about we just move on to the next slide and we can share this out for folks to see. Okay, so let me just describe it in a nutshell so you know what it is. So these circular centers, as I mentioned, are production warehouses. Now we've got a couple of them that are going into production. In a couple of years, we'll have about 9 or 10 of them around the world that will intercept over 80% of all of our decommissioned assets. We still have an ecosystem of partners, of course, who work with these assets as they come out, but we'd like to be in a position where we can determine what happens to every part, so that we can start to track our sustainability outcomes, in addition to ensuring compliance and minimizing risk and getting the maximum value as well. So the traditional focus of IT disposition continues, but we've got this other layer to look at sustainable outcomes. So I want to talk a little bit about what we can do collectively. This is OCP. It's a great collection of like minds. We have a lot of collective power to do some things that are very interesting and impactful. I don't think we need to wait for regulations in this case. We could certainly establish some guidelines for our industry. We could talk about voluntary methods for reverse logistics. We could talk about circular design principles. We're working on design guidelines at the moment that we would love to share out to this community and to a broader set of partners to start to engage in a meaningful dialogue about what it means to do design within a circular economy. We can certainly look at common methods for measurement to establish sustainability methodologies that we can actually agree on. So when one company talks about getting to carbon neutral, it should be very similar to how another company talks about the same thing. Once we get to these points, we can start to talk about meaningful action together. We can certainly also work together on regulations, on working with policymakers to look at various mechanisms. For example, in the EU, there are discussions about tax incentives or border taxation or things of that kind, which on the one hand are good things to think about from a country perspective. But as a community within OCP, I think we need to help them shape these in a way that is conducive to sustainable business models as well. So with that, I'm going to end, and I'll invite any questions that you might have on this or any aspect of sustainability that Microsoft is engaged in. And I'd love to also open to further discussions after OCP with partners who are here and who are interested in engaging with us, learning from us or teaching us as well.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, for a wonderful keynote on circularity at the center. Are there any questions from the audience? So, looks like there are no questions. So, with that, we would like to conclude today's session. There are a couple of closing comments I wanted to make. First and foremost, this is the first time in Open Compute Summit a sustainability-related track has been put together. And you can see from the quality of the content and the breadth of the topics discussed over the whole day that this is absolutely an immediate and burning topic in everybody's mind. So it's fantastic to see this kind of engagement on the very first time when the track is put together. I've been in OCP for many years, and usually when you start the project or start a track, it always takes a while to warm up. And here it's complete engagement from the community. So fantastic to see that. There are a couple of key themes which emerged from today's session, which at least I observed. One was related to need for data transparency and carbon accounting. And it's quite simple. Long time back, I read somewhere that what you cannot measure, you cannot improve. So it's a simple point of making sure that we know what we are measuring, so we know how to improve. The second theme which emerged, and Dr. Anand double-clicked on it, was design for circularity. This is at the center and heart for everything which is happening. And in fact, within Open Compute sustainability, we have two tracks, and one of them is dedicated to circularity, and it's being led by Famida and John. So obviously, that's very, very key. And last but not least, as we say, it's one team, hashtag one team. We all have to row in the same direction. This problem of sustainability is it's transcending the supply chain. In fact, there was a very beautiful slide I saw where even the definition of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 across the value chain is so complex, which means somebody's scope 1, scope 2 is affecting somebody's scope 3, right? Upstream, downstream. And that means you have to solve the problem by working across the supply chain. So those are the three things, if you can take away from this, that would be amazing. So what is it that we can do going forward? Please give your liberal feedback on how we can improve for the next summit, what are the areas we can work on, and please get engaged on all things happening within OCP on sustainability and circularity. There are two work streams which are right now in full flow. One of them is on measurements and metrics, and the other one is on life cycle and circularity. So feel free to engage in both of them. And then, we also have a white paper which we have just released. We would love all of you to take a look at it, give us a critical feedback on it so that we can find a way to improve it and release a second version of it. So with that, last but not least, I know personally how much effort has gone in putting this track together. It's a completely non-trivial amount of effort to bring all these speakers, create a narrative, and make sure everything falls together. So I want to thank Famida for taking the charge here and working with John Miranda and Jordan in driving this whole narrative on the track. And everybody else, Kari and everybody else supported and make sure that we put together a very compelling content. So truly, OCP embodies a community effort, and this was one of the most beautiful examples I saw of people working together, selflessly to ensure that the best outcome for community transpires. So with that, thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the rest of the evening.